Have you ever had someone try to take what's rightfully yours? Well, buckle up, because what happened to me will make your blood boil. Imagine waking up one morning to find strangers measuring your backyard for a community pool. A pool you never asked for from an HOA you never joined. That's exactly what happened to me, and let me tell you, they picked the wrong homeowner to mess with. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I've always been a private person. That's why when I purchased my home in Pinewood Heights 5 years ago, the corner lot with the extra large backyard was the selling point. The real estate agent mentioned something about an HOA in the neighboring streets, but made it crystal clear. My property sat just outside their jurisdiction. Perfect. I wanted none of that micromanagement in my life. My name is David Miller, and I turned that backyard into my personal sanctuary, a vegetable garden that supplied me with fresh produce from spring to fall. A fire pit surrounded by Adirondack chairs where friends gathered on cool evenings. A small workshop where I tinkered with woodworking projects on weekends. As an IT consultant working from home, that yard became my escape when the digital world became too much. Mornings were my favorite. Coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over my Japanese maple tree, planning my day while birds provided the soundtrack. The rest of Pinewood Heights could have their perfectly manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. My slightly wild, perfectly personalized space was everything I wanted. My neighbor to the east, Emma Chen, appreciated my independence. "Your yard gives this neighborhood character," she'd say, passing over homemade kimchi in exchange for my tomatoes. Emma lived just inside the HOA boundary and regularly complained about their nitpicking. Last week, they measured my grass with a ruler, David. A ruler. I'd heard plenty about Patricia Wilson, the HOA president, a retired school administrator who approached neighborhood governance with the same rigid authority she'd wielded over middle schoolers for 30 years. Her assistant in all things HOA was Robert Thompson, a retired accountant who seemed to live for sending violation notices. But their rules weren't my problem. My deed was clear. My property ended at the line of river birches I'd planted along the back edge, and none of it fell under HOA jurisdiction. I paid my city taxes, kept things reasonably tidy, and lived in peace. That peace shattered on a Tuesday in April. I was in my home office on a video call when a shadow passed by my window, then another. Assuming it was package delivery, I ignored it until the call ended. When I stepped outside 20 minutes later, I froze. 3 people stood in my backyard, measuring tape stretched across my vegetable garden, clipboards in hand. "Excuse me?" I called out, trying to keep my voice level. "Can I help you with something?" The woman in the center turned, her pearl necklace gleaming in the spring sunshine. Her crisp pantsuit seemed excessive for backyard measurements, but everything about her screamed authority. "Mr. Miller, I presume. I'm Patricia Wilson, Pinewood Heights HOA president." She didn't extend her hand. "We're just taking some preliminary measurements for the community pool project." I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "The what?" "The community pool." Her tone suggested I was slow on the uptake. "The membership voted last month. This corner of the neighborhood gets the most sun exposure, and the land grade is ideal. We'll need to remove those vegetable plots, of course, but the committee will compensate you with a lifetime pool membership." The man beside her, Robert, I presumed, nodded enthusiastically. "It's quite generous. Pool memberships normally cost $500 annually." I took a deep breath. "There seems to be a misunderstanding. I'm not part of your HOA." Patricia's smile didn't waver. "Your property falls within our development plans. The board has already approved the expansion of jurisdiction. You'll be receiving the official notice next week." She gestured toward my garden. "We'll need to break ground by June to have it ready for summer." My mouth went dry. You can't just claim my property. We're not claiming it, Mr. Miller. We're improving the neighborhood. Your property value will increase significantly. She checked her watch. We should finish these measurements. The landscaper needs them by tomorrow. I stepped in front of her. I'm going to have to ask you all to leave, now. Patricia's eyes narrowed. This is happening, Mr. Miller. The pool will benefit everyone. Don't be difficult. This is private. Property. Leave or I'm calling the police. Robert cleared his throat nervously. Perhaps we should continue another time, Patricia. She glared at me for a long moment before tucking her clipboard under her arm. We'll be in touch, Mr. Miller. I suggest you review the paperwork when it arrives. Fighting progress never ends well. They left, but the knot in my stomach remained. I immediately called the city planning office, who confirmed no permits had been filed for a pool on my property. That was something, at least. But Patricia's confidence rattled me. Could an HOA really expand its territory without homeowner consent? I spent the evening researching, learning more about HOA law than I ever wanted to know. By midnight, I was reasonably confident they couldn't legally take my land, but that didn't mean they wouldn't try. The next morning, I found a glossy brochure in my mailbox. Coming soon, Pinewood Heights Community Pool and Recreation Center. There was my backyard, photoshopped to show a sparkling pool where my vegetable garden stood. The Japanese maple had been replaced with a snack bar. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, this was war. Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia's campaign intensified. Official-looking letters arrived describing the Neighborhood Improvement Initiative. Emma reported that the HOA was telling residents I had already agreed to sell the land, but was now demanding more money. Neighbors I barely knew stopped me in the grocery store, some thanking me for my community spirit, others questioning why I was holding up progress. I tried reason first. I wrote a clear, firm letter to the HOA board clarifying that I was not a member, had no intention of becoming one, and would not be selling any portion of my property. I sent it certified mail to create a paper trail. Their response came 3 days later. A formal notice that Patricia and Robert would be conducting another site visit to discuss options agreeable to all parties. The tone suggested I should be grateful for their flexibility. When they arrived, I was prepared. I had property boundary markers clearly visible and a copy of my deed in hand. Mr. Miller, Patricia began, her voice honey-sweet. I think we got off on the wrong foot. The HOA is prepared to make a generous offer for this portion of your yard. She handed me a document outlining a sum that was perhaps a quarter of the land's actual value. Not interested, I replied, returning the paper unread. Robert stepped forward. David, may I call you David? This pool will be wonderful for the community. Children will learn to swim. Seniors will have water aerobics. Imagine the neighborhood gatherings. Sounds great. Build it on HOA property. Patricia's pleasant mask slipped. There isn't suitable HOA property available. Your lot is perfect, and frankly, what do you need all this space for? One person with an excessive garden and an eyesore of a workshop. I felt my temper rising, but kept my voice level. What I do with my property isn't your concern, because, and I can't stress this enough, I am not in your HOA. That's being addressed, she said dismissively. The board is petitioning the city to redraw the development boundaries. It's a simple administrative matter. Now I understood their strategy. They were trying to retroactively absorb my property into their jurisdiction. I've already spoken with the city planning office, I countered. They confirmed any boundary change would require my consent as the property owner. Patricia's eyes narrowed. There are other ways to accomplish our goals, Mr. Miller. The pool is happening. The only question is how difficult you want to make things for yourself. After they left, I installed security cameras covering every angle of my yard. Something told me this wasn't over. I was right. 2 days later, I returned from grocery shopping to find a team of workers pounding stakes with orange ribbons along my garden perimeter. When I confronted them, they produced a work order signed by Patricia, marked "Preliminary Survey Approved" by property owner. I ordered them off my property and immediately called the police to report trespassing. The responding officer seemed bored by the whole situation, but documented the false work order. "Neighborhood disputes," he sighed. "Always messy." That evening, a petition circulated through Pinewood Heights. "Support the community pool project. Don't let one selfish homeowner block progress." By morning, according to Emma, it had over 50 signatures. The pressure continued. Anonymous notes in my mailbox. A sudden influx of code violation complaints to the city about my workshop, which violated no codes. Someone even called animal control, claiming I was running an illegal chicken farm. I didn't own chickens. I tried one more reasonable approach. I attended the next HOA meeting, held at the community center just down the street. As I walked in, conversations hushed. Patricia, standing at the podium, looked like she'd swallowed something sour. "Mr. Miller, this is a closed meeting for HOA members only. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "I'm aware," I replied calmly. "I'd like to address the board regarding the pool proposal." Robert whispered something to Patricia, who reluctantly nodded. "You have 3 minutes." I walked to the front of the room, facing about 30 neighbors. Many I recognized, but barely knew. I understand everyone wants a community pool. That's a great amenity for a neighborhood. But there seems to be confusion about my property. I am not an HOA member. My land is not for sale, and any documents suggesting otherwise are fraudulent. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Patricia," I continued, "has been spreading misinformation. She's falsely claimed I agreed to sell my land, falsified work orders, and is now attempting to pressure me through community ostracism. These actions aren't just unethical. Some are illegal." Patricia stood up. "That's enough. Mr. Miller is self-serving and spreading lies. The board has been transparent. Is it true?" A woman in the back interrupted. "Did he never agree to sell his land?" Patricia faltered. "We're in ongoing negotiations." "That's not what you told us last week," someone else called out. The meeting devolved into chaotic crosstalk. I slipped out, hoping I'd created enough doubt to slow Patricia's momentum. The next morning, I found my Japanese maple had been cut down overnight. The security cameras had been tilted upward, showing only empty sky. That was the final straw. I'm a planner by nature. My IT career taught me that brute force rarely solves problems. You need strategy, information, and sometimes creative solutions. Patricia had resources, but I had motivation and time. This was my home. First, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. Through Emma, who reluctantly agreed to help, I obtained copies of HOA meeting minutes going back 6 months. The pool project had emerged suddenly in February, championed aggressively by Patricia. Interestingly, the initial proposal had placed it in a different location, a currently unused lot, actually owned by the HOA. Why the change? I dug deeper, searching public records and property assessments. What I discovered was illuminating. The unused lot sat directly behind Patricia's home. The pool would have blocked her mountain view, a generous description of the distant hills barely visible on clear days. So Patricia had redirected the project to my yard instead. Classic. NIMBY syndrome, not in my backyard, but that wasn't all. The contractor selected for the pool project was Horizon Pools, LLC. A bit more digging revealed that Horizon's owner was none other than Patricia's son-in-law. The contract value? Nearly double the average cost for a pool of the proposed size. I compiled everything into a detailed dossier, but I didn't reveal it yet. Information was power, but timing was everything. Next, I consulted Mark Stevens, a local attorney specializing in property disputes. After reviewing my documents, he confirmed what I already suspected. "They have no legal standing," he assured me. "You're not in the HOA. They can't force you to join, and they certainly can't take your land without consent. But," he added, "fighting this could get expensive and drawn out." "What would you recommend?" I asked. "Send a cease and desist letter. Document everything, and consider filing a harassment complaint if the behavior continues." I followed his advice, but I knew legal warnings wouldn't deter Patricia. She was too invested, too confident in her authority. The formal avenues would be my backup, but I needed something more immediate, more effective. That night, as I looked out at the stump of my Japanese maple, inspiration struck. Patricia valued appearances and authority above all else. So that's where I would hit her. The next morning, I visited the hardware store. The elderly owner, Walt, had heard about my situation. News traveled fast in Pinewood Heights. "Standing your ground, eh?" he asked as he rang up my purchases. "Good for you." "Just protecting what's mine," I replied. "Sometimes that requires more than politeness," he said with a wink. "Let me know if you need anything else." I spent the weekend preparing, constructing, and planning. By Sunday evening, I was ready. On Monday morning, I left for a coffee shop, deliberately visible to the neighbors who'd begun watching my comings and goings. As expected, within an hour, Emma texted me, "Patricia and Robert just went into your backyard with another survey crew." Perfect. Let the consequences begin. What Patricia and her team didn't know was that I'd spent the weekend installing a sophisticated sprinkler system throughout my backyard. Not the regular kind, this was my own custom creation. I'd buried perforated hoses beneath a thin layer of soil connected to a high-pressure pump. The system was controlled remotely through my phone, but that wasn't all. I'd mixed a special solution into the reservoir, a combination of water, biodegradable food coloring, and liquid fertilizer with a particularly pungent odor. Completely harmless, environmentally safe, but with effects that would linger for days. From my laptop at the coffee shop, I watched through my security cameras as Patricia directed the survey team across my garden. Robert was meticulously taking notes, looking officious in a button-down shirt and khakis. The workers seemed confused about being there without the owner present, but Patricia's authoritative demeanor kept them moving. I waited until they were perfectly positioned. Patricia standing right in the center of what she envisioned as the future pool, Robert beside her, the workers spread out across my yard. With one tap on my phone, chaos erupted. The sprinklers activated with a forceful hiss, shooting jets of blue-tinted, foul-smelling liquid 6 feet into the air. The surprise was total. Patricia screamed, her clipboard flying as she raised her hands to shield her designer outfit. Too late. Robert spun in confusion, slipped on the suddenly muddy ground, and landed flat on his back, blue liquid spattering his face and chest. The workers scattered, but not before getting thoroughly soaked. The liquid was harmless but unpleasant. The fertilizer component carried a smell reminiscent of aged compost with notes of fish emulsion. And the blue dye, while temporary on skin, would take multiple washes to fade from clothing. Through my camera, I watched Patricia trying to maintain dignity while dripping blue liquid, her white pantsuit now a splotchy disaster. She fumbled for her phone, likely to call the police, but dropped it in a puddle. Robert had managed to stand, but resembled a drowned blue rat, his thinning hair plastered to his scalp. I finished my coffee, paid my bill, and drove home unhurriedly. When I pulled into my driveway, a small crowd had gathered at the edge of my property. Patricia, Robert, and the workers stood in a wet, blue-tinged cluster. A police cruiser was parked on the street. I approached with an expression of innocent confusion. "What's going on here? And why are you people on my property again?" Patricia launched forward, blue droplets flying from her gesticulating hands. You did this deliberately. Officer, I want him arrested for assault." The officer, looking like he was fighting to maintain professionalism, turned to me. "Sir, did you set up some kind of sprinkler trap on your property?" "Trap? No, officer. I installed an automatic irrigation system for my garden this weekend. It's set to run on a timer. I displayed the app on my phone. I'm not responsible for people trespassing on my clearly marked private property when the system activates." "He's lying," Patricia shrieked. "He waited until we were here. This is assault." "With water?" I asked innocently. "It's just water with some plant fertilizer, completely organic and safe." I turned to the officer. "What I'd like to know is why these people are trespassing on my property again after receiving both verbal warnings and a legal cease and desist letter." Robert, seemingly more aware of their precarious legal position, tugged at Patricia's sleeve. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion after changing clothes." The officer, clearly seeing this for the neighborhood dispute it was, sighed deeply. "Ma'am, do you have permission to be on this property?" "We're conducting official HOA business," Patricia insisted, though her authority was somewhat diminished by the blue streak running down her cheek. "I am not an HOA member," I stated firmly, "and I have documentation proving this property is not under HOA jurisdiction." The officer turned to Patricia. "Ma'am, if you don't have the property owner's permission to be here, you need to leave. Now, if you have a dispute about property lines or jurisdiction, that's a civil matter." "This isn't over," Patricia hissed as she stormed past me, leaving blue footprints on the sidewalk. Robert followed, muttering apologies, his squelching shoes marking his retreat. The workers, looking relieved to escape the situation, quickly packed their equipment. One of them whispered as he passed, "Nice system, man. My cousin does irrigation too. Told them this didn't seem right." As they departed, the neighbors who had gathered began to disperse, several hiding smiles behind their hands. Emma gave me a discreet thumbs up from her driveway, but Patricia's parting words proved true. It wasn't over. By evening, photos of her blue-stained self had circulated on the neighborhood social media group, accompanied by her version of events. I was a deranged homeowner who had booby-trapped my yard to injure innocent community volunteers. What she didn't anticipate was the backlash. Several neighbors who had witnessed the scene corrected the narrative. Others questioned why the HOA president was on non-HOA property without permission. Someone even posted the property plat maps showing clear boundaries. The blue dye incident became the talk of Pinewood Heights. Patricia and Robert became reluctant neighborhood celebrities, their blue-tinged appearance lingering for days despite their best efforts to scrub it away. I heard from Emma that Patricia had to cancel a charity luncheon she was supposed to host because her skin still had a distinct blue cast. But the most satisfying consequence came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the sprinkler incident, I received a call from Councilwoman Jenkins, head of the City Planning Committee. "Mr. Miller," she began, "I understand there's been some confusion about property jurisdiction in Pinewood Heights." I explained the situation, including Patricia's persistent attempts to claim my property and the falsified documents. "I see," she said thoughtfully. "Actually, this isn't the first complaint about this HOA. Would you be willing to attend next week's planning meeting? I think it's time for some clarity." I agreed immediately. The meeting was held at Town Hall, a venue that lent gravity to the proceedings. I arrived early, taking a seat in the front row. To my surprise, nearly half the residents of Pinewood Heights trickled in over the next 20 minutes. Emma sat beside me, giving my arm a supportive squeeze. "Word got around," she whispered. "People are curious." Patricia and Robert arrived last, taking seats near the back. Patricia had managed to remove most of the blue tint from her skin, though her hair still had a faint azure sheen in certain lights. Councilwoman Jenkins called the meeting to order and immediately addressed the elephant in the room. "We're here to clarify HOA boundaries for Pinewood Heights and address some concerning reports of boundary overreach." She displayed a large property map on the screen. The official boundaries are clearly defined in the city records. They cannot be altered without formal application, public hearing, and consent of all affected property owners. Patricia raised her hand. The HOA board has voted to expand. Mrs. Wilson, the councilwoman interrupted firmly. HOA votes do not supersede city zoning laws or property rights. She pointed to my property on the map. This lot, along with several others on the perimeter, are definitively outside HOA jurisdiction. Any claims to the contrary are invalid. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Furthermore, Jenkins continued, we've received documentation of concerning practices by the current HOA leadership, including falsified work orders, misrepresentation to members, and harassment of non-member property owners. She shuffled some papers. There's also the matter of the pool contract awarded to Horizon Pools LLC, owned by Mrs. Wilson's son-in-law, at a cost 87% above market rate without competitive bidding, in violation of HOA bylaws requiring transparent procurement processes. The room erupted. Patricia stood, face flushed. That's completely... I have the documentation here, Jenkins stated, holding up a thick folder, including emails between you and Mr. Thompson discussing how to conceal the familial connection. I hadn't expected this. My research had uncovered the connection, but I hadn't known about the emails. Someone else had been digging too. Jenkins raised her hand for quiet. The city cannot intervene in HOA governance directly, but given the evidence of potential financial impropriety, we are referring this matter to the district attorney's office for review. Patricia and Robert exchanged panicked glances. In the meantime, Jenkins continued, we are issuing a cease and desist order regarding any pool construction plans until this matter is resolved. And to be absolutely clear, she pointed to my property on the map again. This lot and the others outside the red boundary line are not subject to HOA rules or authority. Any attempts to claim otherwise could result in legal consequences. The meeting continued, but Patricia and Robert slipped out silently during the discussion that followed. By the next day, both had resigned from the HOA board, citing personal reasons. The pool project was officially suspended pending financial review. But the most surprising development came a week later when a neighborhood-wide vote disbanded the HOA entirely. Years of Patricia's micromanagement had created a simmering resentment that finally boiled over. The monthly dues were redirected to a simpler neighborhood association focused on community events rather than rule enforcement. As for my backyard, it flourished that summer. I planted a new Japanese maple, larger than the one I had lost. My vegetable garden expanded, and I built a pergola where neighbors gathered for informal potlucks. Patricia and Robert both put their houses on the market by fall. I heard through Emma that Patricia's blue-tinged hair had become a recognizable feature at real estate showings, causing potential buyers to whisper and point. On the anniversary of the sprinkler incident, Pinewood Heights held its first annual neighborhood barbecue in the community park. Someone had jokingly placed a small blue sprinkler as a centerpiece on the main table. People laughed, sharing stories of Patricia's reign with the freedom of those who had escaped a benevolent dictatorship. Emma nudged me as we watched children playing on the new playground equipment the neighborhood association had installed with the former HOA funds. No, she said. In a weird way, we should thank Patricia. Without her trying to take your yard, none of this would have happened. I smiled, watching my neighbors enjoy each other's company without rule books or violation notices. Sometimes, I replied, the best community forms when someone tries to bully the wrong person. My quiet corner lot remained my sanctuary, but now it was also something more. A symbol of standing your ground, of finding creative solutions, and of how sometimes a well-timed sprinkler can wash away years of petty tyranny. The HOA never did get their community pool, But Pinewood Heights got something better, an actual community. 2 years after the blue sprinkler incident, Pinewood Heights had transformed completely. Where once stood identical mailboxes and tension-filled HOA meetings, now flourished a genuine community. I'd watch from my porch as neighbors chatted freely, children played between yards without fear of violating regulations, and property values, contrary to Patricia's dire predictions, had increased by 12%. My corner lot became something of a neighborhood landmark. The Japanese maple I'd planted to replace the one lost in the battle had grown surprisingly fast, already casting shade where I'd placed a bench. Sometimes I'd find neighbors sitting there, enjoying a quiet moment. I never minded. The victory felt communal now. Emma and I had become close friends. She now headed the neighborhood association, voluntary, focused on building connections rather than enforcing rules, and transparently managed. "Did you see who bought Patricia's house?" Emma asked one evening over dinner on my patio. "Young couple from downtown, artists. They're painting their front door purple." I laughed. Patricia would have had an aneurysm. "That's not even the best part," Emma continued. "They're converting the garage into a studio for free community art classes." The irony wasn't lost on me. Patricia's former home, once the fortress of conformity, was becoming a creative hub for the neighborhood. Robert had moved to a strictly regulated senior community across town and promptly joined another HOA board. As for Patricia, rumors occasionally drifted back. She'd moved to a gated community 30 miles away, where she'd already clashed with their HOA over garden gnomes. Last I heard, she was gathering signatures to run for their board. Some people are simply hardwired to seek control. I thought about that often, how differently Patricia and I viewed community. For her, it was something to be controlled, standardized, protected from deviation. For me, it was organic, strengthened by individuality rather than threatened by it. The pool that started it all was eventually built, though not in anyone's backyard. The neighborhood association partnered with the city to renovate an abandoned lot 2 blocks over. With combined funding and volunteer labor, we created a modest community space with a small pool, playground, and picnic area. The project cost less than half of what Patricia's backyard palace would have. During the grand opening celebration, Walt, the hardware store owner, who'd helped me with my sprinkler system, pulled me aside. "Did I ever tell you I was the original holdout?" he asked, gesturing around with his cane. "What do you mean?" "When they first built Pinewood Heights in the 80s, I owned 3 acres here, had my hardware store on this very spot." He tapped the concrete pool deck. "Developers wanted all my land. I sold them most of it, but kept my corner lot and refused to join their fancy HOA. I stared at him, connecting dots I'd never noticed. "So you were the first." "First troublemaker," he finished with a grin. "They tried everything to force me out. Had a board president back then, Richard something, who was Patricia's spiritual predecessor. Why didn't you tell me when I was fighting them?" "Some battles a man needs to fight his own way," he replied. "Besides, you did something I never managed. You didn't just hold your ground, you helped everyone see a better alternative." One crisp October morning, a woman in a business suit approached as I worked in my garden. "Mr. Miller? I'm Diane Levinson from the Urban Planning Department at State University. Pinewood Heights has become a case study for us, a neighborhood that transitioned from a strict HOA to a voluntary association with remarkable success." I raised an eyebrow. "We're a case study. Property values up, community engagement increased, crime rates down," she noted. "Most neighborhoods that dissolve HOAs experience decline in these metrics. Pinewood Heights defied those trends." After explaining my story, Diane observed, "What's interesting is that you never set out to change the entire neighborhood. You were simply protecting your property." "That's true," I acknowledged. yet you ended up more connected to your community than ever before. Her observation struck me forcefully. Before Patricia's pool plans, I'd valued my lot primarily for its privacy. Now I knew nearly everyone on my street, helped organize events, taught weekend workshops in my once private space. The very privacy I'd fought to protect had transformed into something more valuable, genuine connection on my own terms. Fighting for my property wasn't really about the land, I told Diane. It was about having the freedom to choose how I engaged with my community. That evening at our monthly neighborhood potluck, watching children play while adults chatted over food, I had a moment of clarity. Patricia had been right about one thing. Property values were connected to community. She'd just fundamentally misunderstood what made a community valuable. It wasn't uniformity or compliance or aesthetics. It was something simpler. The freedom to belong authentically, to contribute uniquely, to connect by choice rather than coercion. Emma approached with lemonade. "You look philosophical tonight." "Just thinking about boundaries," I replied, "and how the best ones are permeable." She followed my gaze across the gathered neighbors. "None of this would have happened if Patricia hadn't tried to build that pool in your yard." I laughed. "Are you suggesting we thank her?" "God, no!" Emma snorted. "But it's interesting how her need for control ultimately created its opposite here. In that moment, I understood something essential about community and belonging. The land we inhabit matters, but not nearly as much as how we choose to inhabit it together. Boundaries matter too, but mainly as definitions of responsibility rather than division. The following weekend, I planted a new sign at the edge of my property. Not no trespassing or private property, but something simpler. "Welcome, please use the gate." It wasn't a surrender of boundaries, but a recognition that the best boundaries are the ones we choose to open ourselves. Patricia would never understand that. But as I watched neighbors chat at my garden fence, children asking permission to pick tomatoes, and Emma arriving with kimchi to trade for my basil, I knew I'd found something far more valuable than victory in a neighborhood dispute. I'd found the perfect balance between standing my ground and opening my gate, a lesson in boundaries and belonging that no HOA manual could ever teach. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.